Hey, AP Eagles. Welcome back to our last full week of review before the AP exam on May 15th. We're going to be starting on page 16 in our review notebooks. Hopefully you guys had a chance to look over the topics that I posted for you guys this week. We're going to go from page 16 all the way up through page 24 this week, and that's going to take us from basically the rest of Unit 5 and then all of Unit 6. What that'll do is next week, at the beginning of the week, we'll be able to quickly recap Unit 7. But remember, Unit 7 shouldn't need a whole lot of recapping because it's the most recent topic that we covered and included things like American imperialism with the Spanish-American War, World War I, the Roaring Twenties, Great Depression, New Deal stuff. So all of those things that we just covered the previous few weeks before we started doing our review is Unit 7. So you guys have those note packets with you guys, hopefully still. And of course you can utilize those for your review at the beginning of next week as well, okay? A bunch of important things happening. Just so you guys know, at the beginning of next week, you guys should be getting your login ID for the AP exam. You guys should also be practicing signing into the AP College Board for the exam. I sent out that link yesterday. Make sure you guys take just a few minutes. It won't take you very long, but take the time to practice logging in so that you guys know what you're going to do on May 15th. Remember, you're going to log in a half hour early. You're going to get into the test. You're going to get yourself all set up with your materials and supplies and all those things so that you guys can take off with that 45-minute DBQ essay as soon as it starts. Get that thing in and get yourself some college credit. All right, so with that being said, I do want to go through 3 pages today. And page 16 of your review notebook started with failed compromises on slavery. Now remember, leading up to the Civil War, there were multiple attempts to try to deal with the issue of slavery. Some of them more successful than others. But even the ones that are the most successful are ultimately just temporary solutions. None of these are long-term solutions. So what I would do is I would kind of go like a timeline, start with the first compromises and just kind of keep working your way through and seeing how they all connect. So in the page that I put out to you guys, we started with the Missouri Compromise, which I know we already went over on one of our previous pages. But remember, Missouri Compromise from 1820. And as the country is starting to expand and more places are applying for statehood, Congress is going to have to come up with more creative solutions for how to keep that balance between free and slave states. So Missouri Compromise, Missouri becomes a slave state, Maine becomes a free state, and that Mason-Dixon line is established as the boundary for future slavery. Now, in general, Missouri Compromise is a fairly successful compromise for 25 to 30 years or so. That Dred Scott case, that's going to take place in the mid-1850s. And you guys know this court case. Dred Scott is a slave. His owner moves him into non-slave territory. He will sue for his freedom and will lose. And basically what the Supreme Court says is that property in one location is property in another location. Just because you cross borders doesn't mean all of a sudden your property is no longer yours. But more importantly, what that's going to do is, if that decision is correct, that essentially means that the Missouri Compromise is unconstitutional, because the Missouri Compromise said there's a line and slavery doesn't exist above this line. And by declaring that Dred Scott was still a slave, even though he passed north of that Mason-Dixon line, you're essentially saying that the Missouri Compromise is unconstitutional, which of course just sends all of this sectionalism just haywire, right? But let's go back a little bit before the Dred Scott case, okay? So we had the Missouri Compromise in 1820. That one's a fairly successful compromise, at least in the short term. Your next major compromise is going to be the Compromise of 1850. Now remember, this is after Manifest Destiny has already taken place. Territorial expansion was a huge cause of sectionalism. Had the country stayed small and the balance between free and slave states stayed equal, maybe we don't get to this point. But because of Manifest Destiny, because the country is expanding, those questions about slavery and where it should exist and where it shouldn't exist are going to become louder and louder and louder. So for me, manifest destiny and territorial expansion might be the biggest cause of sectionalism moving closer to the Civil War. And that's why the Compromise of 1850 was so important, right? Compromise of 1850, also created by Henry Clay, right, as was the Missouri Compromise, states that California is going to be becoming a free state, that popular sovereignty will be used in certain areas of the Mexican cession, that the slave trade in Washington, D.C. will be outlawed. But the big one, the big piece of the Compromise of 1850 was the idea that the Fugitive Slave Act, which had already been in existence, but the Fugitive Slave Act will now be strengthened. And this is what really, again, sets things off, right? Causes sectionalism to grow. Because Northerners are going to be super frustrated that it is ultimately their responsibility to return runaway slaves. And Northerners don't want that responsibility. They like to keep the issue of slavery sort of away from them. They like to sort of ignore it and pretend that it wasn't their problem. But now it is their problem, because if they're going to be the ones responsible for returning runaway slaves, it ultimately is their issue. Okay, so Compromise of 1850, not very successful at all, because again, it just amps up sectionalism. Another one that you could say not particularly successful is that whole Kansas-Nebraska Act. Remember, Nebraska and Kansas are both territories in the Midwest that are going to be applying for statehood right around the same time. What they decide to do with these territories is, instead of having Congress decide whether they'll be free or slave, they're going to let the people of those territories decide. And that's called popular sovereignty, right? This was a concept that was created just before this time of let the people of the territory decide whether there will be a free state or a slave state. And again, the concept makes sense in a way, but ultimately this is going to be another failed compromise, because what will happen, particularly in Kansas, is pro-slavery forces coming in from the south, anti-slavery forces coming in from the north, all converging in this territory of Kansas, leading to this just boiling tension building in Kansas. And you guys know that ultimately leads to that sort of famous event known as Bleeding Kansas, almost like a small preview of the Civil War that was about to come. So again, the Kansas-Nebraska Act is a compromise, also not successful. We could get into some of those other ideas. Remember, there was the Lecompton Constitution. That never went into effect. Right before the Civil War, something called the Crittenden Compromise. We can look that one up too. We covered it in class. But those are examples of compromises that never even were passed. So I guess what we're ultimately saying, guys, is if you do get that question on the AP exam of, evaluate the effectiveness of political compromise in dealing with sectionalism before the Civil War, if you're going to evaluate the effectiveness of these compromises aren't successful. Again, some of them you could say were successful for a short term, but ultimately we know that the Civil War is bound to happen. It's just a matter of time. Okay, so now you jump over to page 17. Page 17 is about increasing sectionalism. Now, sectionalism, you got to be able to define it first and put it into your words. Sectionalism is that concept that the country is breaking into sections, right? That's where we get sectionalism from. That the North and South are further dividing, that the tension is building, and they are separating more and more and more as we get into the 1840s and 50s and 60s. And if you guys do get a DBQ essay about sectionalism, most likely what you're going to have to pull from for outside information are different events that help to increase sectionalism. And that's what I wanted you guys to do on this page, was start to talk about some of the different things that amp up sectionalism. Well, we already talked about some of them. You could say a territorial expansion, right? Manifest destiny, increase sectionalism, because there's going to be more and more questions about where slavery exists and where it doesn't. The Dred Scott case, right? Dred Scott versus Sanford increases sectionalism because the North hates the Supreme Court's decision in that case. The South, of course, supports it because a slave in one place is a slave everywhere. So we already talked about some of these ideas of increasing sectionalism, but I listed a couple more on this page here for you guys. I do want you guys to know a political event sort of taking place at this time is the creation of the Free Soil Party. Free Soil Party is going to be a political party that's not going to last particularly long. It basically starts in the 1840s and it dies out by the early 1850s. But that Free Soil Party was created specifically because of territorial expansion. And when we expanded to the Pacific and we gained places like the Mexican Cession, there will be questions about should slavery exist there. Well, the Free Soil Party, just as it's named, believed that this soil should be free of slavery and ultimately free of African Americans. The Free Soil Party has sort of a weird sort of mixed message. When you hear Free Soil Party, you assume that they're sort of abolitionists. And the reason that they don't want slavery there is because they're against slavery. And that was probably true of some people in the Free Soil Party, but it wasn't true of all of them. Some people in the Free Soil Party didn't want slavery because they ultimately didn't want African Americans in the West. The idea was this new land was supposed to be for white Americans. So this Free Soil Party has a little bit of a mixed message, I suppose. But know that it's going to increase sectionalism because, again, you have one group of people saying no slavery in this new territory, while many Southerners are saying, no, we want slavery in this territory, and the tension is building. Don't forget, too, that as that Free Soil Party dies out, what it will ultimately lead into is the emergence of the Republican Party, the party of Lincoln, going into that 1860 election. We have some other events that increased sectionalism here, and these ones are quick. Don't forget Uncle Tom's Cabin, right? One of the most famous books of the entire 19th century, written by Harriet Beecher Stowe. Remember Abraham Lincoln's favorite quote, or famous quote, I should say, after the start of the Civil War, when he meets Harriet Beecher Stowe and says, "So you're the little woman that started this big war." Remember, Uncle Tom's Cabin was a fictional story. But what it did is it gave many Northerners who had never seen slavery and never experienced what it looked like, it gave them a true glimpse of what it would have been like to be a slave in the South through this story. And again, of course, Northerners will be outraged by it. Southerners will say that it's propaganda. But the tension is building, right? The caning of Sumner, if you guys remember this one, Preston Brooks is responsible for the caning of Charles Sumner, who had attacked slavery and his family on the Senate floor. And Preston Brooks will attack Charles Sumner, caning him to the point where he can't do the job anymore. And remember that Northerners will vote him back into office, even though he can't serve, just to leave his seat open in the Senate as a reminder to the South of, hey, we're not going to forget what you did to our guy. And Southerners, of course, support Preston Brooks, sending him canes as sort of like a symbol of, yeah, we support what you did. So sectionalism increasing. One of the big ones, too, is John Brown's raid on Harper's Ferry. Remember John Brown, sort of that radical abolitionist that believed in leading a violent slave uprising. He was involved in Bleeding Kansas during that time, fled east, and eventually found himself in Virginia plotting an attack on the federal arsenal at Harper's Ferry in Virginia. And of course, the raid fails, and John Brown will be arrested after his sons are killed, and he will be found guilty and he will be executed. But his execution is, again, what really increases sectionalism, because, of course, Southerners will claim victory and justice for this, wild, murderous maniac. And Northerners will start to see John Brown as a martyr, right? Someone that died for the cause, someone that gave his life to try to fight against the immorality of slavery. Sectionalism, it's just building, right? All of these little events are just show that clash between the North and the South. But the last one that you have to mention if you're going to talk about sectionalism is that election of 1860, Abraham Lincoln's election, where he wins the election without a single electoral vote from the South. And it's really that moment where Southerners are going to say, if our votes don't matter in this country, if a presidential candidate can win an election without getting any electoral votes from us, then ultimately we don't matter in this country anymore, and we don't want to be part of this country anymore. And this is really where the concept of nullification comes back. Remember, South Carolina had brought this up a long time ago under Andrew Jackson with the Tariff of Abominations. But what they're basically going to say is the states make up the government. They are a compact of states that make up the government. And ultimately, the states then have the power to nullify laws or to say that they don't want to be a compact anymore that makes up this government. And that will lead to secession. And South Carolina is going to be the first to secede, and other southern states, specifically in the Deep South first, will start to break away from the Union, and that's where we see the start of the Civil War. And that, my friends, is going to take us to our last page for the day, and that's the Civil War itself. So honestly, and you guys probably remember this when we covered the Civil War in class, I told you don't need to remember a whole lot about the actual war itself, the fighting and the battles and memorizing generals' names and locations and all those kinds of things. It's more causes of the war, which we already talked about. There's your sectionalism stuff. But also sort of government actions during the war. That seems to be the key to understanding the Civil War and answering questions on it. So we already talked about secession. We know it's the idea of breaking away. South Carolina is going to be the first to secede. We also know that Lincoln's goal at the start of the Civil War is to preserve the Union. He does not believe that nullification is legal. He does not believe that the states are more powerful than the federal government. It is his responsibility to preserve this country and settle that idea once and for all that the federal government is supreme over the states. The Civil War will start at Fort Sumter. That's going to be your first major battle. Remember, after it starts there, that's where you really have to look at the advantages and disadvantages, right? And there's a lot of advantages for the Union, for the North. They have the manufacturing base. They have the stable government that has been in place now for almost 100 years. They have the stable economy and currency. They have the transportation system in the form of railroads, the established military, those kinds of things. But the Confederacy does have some advantages too. They do have better generals and commanders, okay, and more experienced ones at that. But the big thing, if you really needed to pinpoint one specific advantage that the South has, it's that whole idea of home field advantage. But in addition to that, the idea that the South doesn't have to be the aggressor here. They don't have to go on the attack. The South can play defense. And if they can play defense in a territory that they know with a friendly civilian population, they can basically just sort of sit back and try to withstand the North. Right? You don't have to go out and win the war. In a sense, you just have to not lose it. And if you drag this war out long enough, perhaps the Union will just give up on it. It's not worth it. And then the South can claim victory. And that's going to be the biggest advantage that the South has, is being able to play defense. The North, of course, will embark on what is known as the Anaconda policy. That's going to be their plan of attack. If the South is just going to sit back, the North is going to wrap itself around the South, and it's known as the Anaconda policy. Okay, just sort of squeeze them into submission. All right, a couple famous battles. I think my video is going to run out here, so I'm going to try to speed this up. A couple important battles. We talked about Fort Sumter already, first major battle of the war. Gettysburg. Gettysburg is the real turning point in the war. The furthest north that the Confederacy ever made it, right? When they finally did decide to go on the offensive a bit, but it failed and they were pushed back. So Gettysburg is a major moment. Appomattox Courthouse, that's where the eventual surrender will take place after Sherman's famous march to the sea, where they sort of really, that Anaconda policy really works finally, after years of fighting, but finally works. But the big thing is this last bullet point, guys, the government actions during the war. Don't forget the Emancipation Proclamation, right? Lincoln frees all slaves, but only in rebelling states. That's significant, right? Doesn't want to create chaos or destroy the relationship with states that didn't break away. Okay, so only in rebelling states. The suspension of habeas corpus, sorry, I had to look at the list here. Remember, it essentially allows Lincoln to declare martial law. If he decides to arrest you for any reason, you are not guaranteed those basic rights of people accused of a crime. You do not get a speedy trial. You do not get to know what you're being charged with. You do not have a specific sentence length. He can keep you in jail for however long he wants. Don't forget the Conscription Act, the draft for the first time ever in American history. And of course, the Gettysburg Address, which is more just a speech, but that powerful speech that we read through and did that close read with in class. Don't forget, guys, one of the things that these actions show us is very simply that during times of war, oftentimes president will exceed their power. And that's where that whole phrase of necessary and proper comes in, right? Lincoln believed that even though he was exceeding what is normally his power as president of the United States, during this particular crisis, it was necessary for him to do that. So even though some people might criticize him as a dictator, ultimately he will be able to justify these actions. And especially when the war is won by the Union in 1865, I think it really clarifies that his actions, in a sense, were just. Unfortunately for him, as we know, he will not get to really celebrate this victory because he ultimately will be assassinated very shortly after the surrender at Appomattox Courthouse. I'm going to jump out of the video here because I think it's going to cut me off here real quick. Take a look at these pages, get those notes filled in. Let me know if you guys have any questions, and I'll be back tomorrow with the next video. Talk to you guys soon.